Awesome. Hey, what's going on, everybody? Hope
Happy
you're having
Friday.
a happy Friday. Hope you're having a great Friday. Man, wherever you're at, whatever day you're listening, I think for both Ben and I, it's a little bit chilly, even in Texas here today, Ben. It's pretty crazy. So my kids got school canceled because it was too cold and icy this morning. So that doesn't happen in Texas very often.
It hit -20 this morning. We were heading out of town to drive to my wife's parents' place, and if we had had more time, there's a coffee shop in Fargo that if it's -20 or below real temperature, they do buy one get one free coffee.
There
So
you
if we had
go.
more time, we were going to stop there. But
It's
that's
good.
the one positive thing about when it hits -20 in Fargo, North Dakota.
Yeah, that's probably the only thing, though.
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, well, let's jump in for a little bit today. Another Friday conversation. Yeah, it's been a couple of weeks since we've been on. So, Ben, why don't you set up our topic today, our conversation, and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah. So we've been talking. We do several times a month with partner ministries that we're working with. We do group coaching calls, and one of the topics that was brought up as kind of our intro training, just kind of a reminder for those leaders. We talked about the importance of rest. And some of the challenges that come with that. And then also, Andy and I have been working on putting together an online course that's going to be titled Productivity for Ministry Leaders. And one of the first trainings in that is the idea of starting from rest. So this has just kind of unintentionally been a recurring theme that's been present on my mind. So I thought it'd be a good topic for a conversation for us in this moment, because man, especially when it's 20 below, you don't want to get out and do anything. That's that
Yeah.
in North Dakota, that's an easy excuse for resting. But the
Well,
reality of being a ministry leader is there is a significant amount of pressure to just keep working, because there's always more to do.
yeah, and we saw that over and over again in these group coaching calls as we were talking to people. Almost everybody raising their hand. Yeah, I struggle with this. Yeah, I struggle with this. Yeah, I struggle with this. And so, yeah, I think it's one of those topics that we don't talk enough about
Yeah, yeah.
as leaders and within ministries, but I think it's an important concept and something that we need to talk more about, honestly, as to be healthy leaders.
Totally. Yeah, and culturally, I mean, particularly in the Western American world, the idea of rest and not doing activity is seen as a significantly negative thing. But you go biblically, and you get a significant amount of scriptural text is about the importance and the value of rest, right? You get the Genesis scene where God creates Adam and Eve, gives them their kind of primary command to fill the earth, subdue it, to rule over the earth, bear God's image. And then the very first thing that happens after that is the seventh day is a day of rest. So after they get their big commissioning, the first thing they do is take a day off with God. And then the probably most hammered on command through much of the Old Testament is the idea of Sabbath. I've been reading through Ezekiel and some of the Old Testament prophets over the last couple months, and man, God is fierce about Sabbath towards Israel. So clearly, there's
Yes.
something about this idea of making intentional space and time for rest that is really a high priority for God, for His people.
Hmm.
Um, let's start with this question. What's some of the things that prevent particularly ministry leaders from resting? Because I think pretty much everyone who's a Christian would verbally acknowledge that, yeah, it's important that I take time to rest. It's important that I practice Sabbath is a valuable thing. I should prioritize time with my family, stuff like that. But we very rarely is that well practiced.
Yeah, I think one of the primary things that I see over and over again with leaders is us slipping into this idea that if we don't do it, it's not going to get done.
Yeah.
In some ways that we have to work harder, we have to work longer, and without us doing our part, then God's not going to be able to do his part. He's not going to
Mm-hmm.
be able to fulfill his mission, the commission, and all this. So I think there's this kind of like, even, I don't know, I mean, you look back in Genesis chapter 3, in some sense, that was the core of it, is our seizing control from God and kind of putting ourselves in that place. And so I would say that kind of the overarching thing that I see that prevents leaders from getting rest is playing God. It's
Yeah.
trying to think that we without us doing our part, then God's not going to be able to do his part. I'm curious, well, how about you, Ben? What are the ways that you say?
Yeah, I think on this related, but maybe flip side of that same issue is I think there's a sense of guilt that comes with I don't know, the mindset of like, okay, I kind of like I owe this to God. Jesus has done so much for
Mm-hmm.
me. I need to do equally as much for him. So there's a sense of guilt where it's like, oh, if I'm not producing, if I'm not active in doing ministry, if I took a week off and did nothing other than, I don't know, whatever your thing of rest is going to be, then somehow you're
Yeah.
not as pleasing to God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's a big one for a
Yeah,
lot of people.
I think sometimes too, even I think we're also like, what will other people think of me?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
if I'm not working hard or I take a week off or something, kind of projecting other people's thoughts on, like
for sure.
we're lazy, we're not working hard enough, whatever. And I would say especially in ministry, because there's like this tension of like that you're connected to people who are supporting you, whether it's
Yep.
like us who are missionaries, right? Or a pastor in a church who has congregates like tithing to the budget that
Yeah, that's
somehow is
huge.
supporting them. And so I think that there can even be this subtle like, well, what will they think of me if I leave the office early? What will they think of me if I
Mm-hmm.
take an extra Friday off? Or, if I actually do take a vacation or a Sabbath. And so I think even sometimes the fear of what people will think of as the fear of man can drive us from starting from rest.
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation with a guy. This was a couple of years ago, and the pastor of the church that I was a part of, it took a month-long sabbatical. Maybe it was 2 months. Um, Whatever. He took a fairly decent chunk of time off for sabbatical. And one of these younger guys I was talking with, he was just basically complaining about it and essentially said, I don't get a sabbatical. I work 8 hours a day. Why should he get a sabbatical? We argued about it a little bit because he was basically saying, I'm going to stop tithing to the church because I don't think this is
Mhm.
the way he should use his time. And it was an interesting conversation because he was very adamant, and I was laying out, your job as a engineer going to work, clocking out, and going home and doing whatever you want is significantly different than a pastor of a church of 500 people. Um, but I think that's a good illustration of there are people who think that way and think that that's biblical to operate under that mindset,
Yeah. So
which is challenging.
what do you think, Ben, is like, as we talk to leaders, what do you think the cost
Mm.
of not starting from rest, how do you think that impacts us as leaders?
Yeah. I mean, just maybe to continue that story, this pastor, he part of the reason that it had been a pre-planned sabbatical, but his son had brain cancer just a few months prior to that and had recovered and is fine. But so he had gone through this really intense season. This sabbatical had already been scheduled. When he came out of that after taking 2 months, 3 months, however long it was, off and coming back to ministry, he actually had a significant amount of energy, refreshed vision, and new excitement for the ministry that going into the sabbatical, he was really feeling drained and just like not producing, not, there wasn't as much passion in his sermons as there normally would be because of this lack of energy and all these other things that had been invested. So I think maybe on a purely pragmatic sense, if you are overwhelmed and not making space for rest in your life, the quality of the ministry that you're doing is going to suffer.
Yeah.
You're going to operate at a lower level than you would if you had that space for rest. So that's a
Yeah.
purely pragmatic thing.
Yeah. And I think the way even that I see that is that in some sense, when we don't have rest, we become more like just kind of responsive to and always kind of reacting to everything that happens, where I think that even the habit of rest and creating space allows us to say yes in a very healthy way, say no in a healthy way.
Yeah.
That creates that for us as being leaders.
It really gives you a significant refresh of perspective to take even just 24 hours to step away from the normal activity and come back with a different viewpoint on things. I think another one of the things you and I were talking about, the news that's been breaking over the last couple of weeks about Ravi Zacharias and some of the things that have come to light since his passing. And I think one of the things, and I've, I don't know what his day-to-day life was, but I think a lot of the acting out in sinful ways, and depression, anxiety, suicide that takes place for people in ministry. A lot of that could be significantly mitigated if there was a reality of saying, I'm prioritizing rest, making space to be present with God, not feeling like I have to produce at this level. Because if you are bearing the weight of this big ministry, a big church or whatever, and carrying that and never stepping back and discovering the beautiful reality that it's actually not your thing to carry, God's the one carrying it, and you can take 2 days off and it's not going to explode. That pressure tends to lead people, particular leaders, to acting out in varying ways. Sometimes sinful, sometimes pseudo sinful. Get angry at your wife or angry at your kids more frequently because you're stressed out. So I think that's a big cost. And in the long run, it leads to moral failure, even suicide, things along those lines, if we're not making space for rest.
Well, I even think about too, because I've been reading this in my Bible reading, is in the Old Testament, even kind of moments of rest in the nation of Israel. And it wasn't just for the people in kind of creating that habit, but it was also to stop and acknowledge something about God and kind of reframe, like, you think about whether it's a festival that happens, annually or, every so often, or, kind of monuments that they set up. What they were designed to do is like create space to stop and pause and reflect and remember what God has done. And so even I think going back to all, what we said at the beginning of kind of seizing control from God as that being one of the things that we see, I think even that habit of rest allows us to stop, pause, acknowledge God, and, and even remember who he is, what he's doing, and that we're in partnership with him, not he's not dependent on us.
And I think that's part of why in the Old Testament, God is so, in some cases, you could almost say vicious about protecting Sabbath, because at its heart, the practice of Sabbath isn't just about having a day off or doing nothing. It's not even about saying, I'm going to read my Bible or I'm going to sing songs to God all day. It's about acknowledging the fact that we are not God. The world doesn't spin because of us. The ministry doesn't happen because of us, that God is the one who's in control. I love one of my favorite lines from a song by the musician Josh Garrels. He's got a song titled The Resistance. And he's talking, most of it in the chorus, at least, he's talking about the idea of rest. He says, my rest is the weapon against the oppression of man's obsession to control things. Which is such a great line, because that really is like the practice of I'm taking the night off, or I'm taking a day off, or we're going on vacation for a week, is a great act of saying, I will resist the pressure to believe that I can control the outcomes if I work hard enough.
Yeah, that's good. So I'm curious, let's talk more, maybe some practicalities as we think about like specific maybe rhythms of rest, or what maybe has helped us sustain within ministry. What do you think are some keys, Ben, for you or with other leaders that we work with?
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it several times already. Sabbath is a huge one. I think that's one of the most foundational rhythms that God puts in place literally from creation's beginning. So that's been a big one. It's particularly challenging to do in our modern day, though, where there's it's really difficult to carve out that space. I was listening to a message from the Rebuilders Conference, which highly recommend. You can Google Rebuilders, and it's a conference from a church somewhere in Australia. Great stuff. well worth listening to. But one of the speakers, she was talking about Sabbath, and she talked about the kind of three keys of Sabbath. She talked about reverence, rest, and resistance, which I thought was a very helpful framework. So reverence being the idea that the Sabbath is a day set apart, it's holy. So come to it with a different kind of attitude, set it apart in some way. Say, I'm not doing work. That's one of the foundational biblical things of Sabbath. So you're going to reverence the day, then also make space for rest in that day. And then I was really intrigued by the third point, the idea of resistance. So resist things of the world on the Sabbath. So a good example would be saying, hey, I'm not going to look at social media, or I'm not going to browse Amazon to buy something, or we're not going to watch TV all day, or whatever the thing may be. The idea is that you resist the pull of the world in some way on Sabbath. So I think that's one of the most foundational rhythms.
Yeah, that's good. I think one of the things that people often don't talk about, and I think this is apparent in our group coaching calls, is the idea of like even recreation and kind of having fun. Because we had this question, we kind of split it into three categories in our group coaching call. We talked about spiritual, Sabbath, time with the Lord. We talked about physical, sleeping, taking care of our bodies, and we talked about play. And I would say that 95% of all the leaders that we kind of in these group coaching calls said play was the one that was the lowest on the list in terms of, I Sabbath well, I get a decent amount of sleep, but the thing I don't well is I don't kind of rejuvenate myself. So I think because I think you're right. I think there's a sense, well, it's Sabbath, we got to shut the lights off, sit on the couch and not do anything all day. And even we're going to mention one of the resources that, Matt Chandler has some great sermons on Sabbath. And I remember listening to that as one of his rhythms that he had in Sabbath is he would actually invite a family over for dinner on Sabbath, and they would spend all day cooking together, like kind of starting, and they would have glasses of wine. I mean, you can't say that if you're Baptist, but like, and just like enjoy each other's company and like fellowship and whatever. And it was so good for me because what it does, it kind of reframed Sabbath to kind of broaden the perspective a little bit. So I think even having some fun things that you're doing, I think are healthy for us as ministry leaders, but I think sometimes goes back to that guilt or what people will think about.
Yeah. Like if you're a ministry leader and you don't have a hobby, you have a problem. And the hobby, one of the guys we were talking, I resonated with this on our group coaching call. He was saying, you kind of all my hobbies are basically like ministry hobbies. Like I love reading theology, so my free time, my play is reading theology, but that's inextricably linked to the fact that you're a preacher and a teacher. So what are the hobbies that you have built into your life that are healthy, that are fulfilling for you? It might be hiking, it might be I don't know, playing board games is one thing that I love to do. That's a really refreshing thing for me. Get a few guys and gals together and play a nerdy board game for an evening.
Yeah. Well, let's keep kind of going down that path as you think about maybe some specifics of what makes good rest, because I think that there's I think one of the things that we have to realize as leaders is you kind of have to know yourself, and you have to know the dynamics of your family in order to kind of position rest well. I think if we try to copy and paste what somebody else is doing, it will be more work than it'll be rest. So what would be maybe some other ideas in terms of what makes good rest for people?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do, I think, with personality stuff. Like for me, like I mentioned, I love having 10 people over and playing board games. It's super refreshing for me. My wife, she enjoys that, but she's an introvert. So for her, rest looks like if she's going to have a night to just chill, it's going to be her probably sitting in our bedroom at her little desk that she has and painting or listening to music and just having this time to disconnect from and not worry about what's going on with other people. Another, I think, indicator of good rest is that you leave it feeling filled. You can spend a night watching 6 hours of TV or playing 6 hours of video games or whatever, and you can leave that feeling just kind of like meh. Versus an activity that's restful, you're going to leave that feeling like satisfied or satiated. Even if you're physically tired. Some of my most refreshing times of rest were like physical activity, like going mountain biking or playing
Yeah.
soccer for an evening or something like that.
Yeah, and that I mean, it reminded me. I remember one of the guys I used to do ministry with, like his Sabbath, his rest was going out and picking weeds in the garden and gardening. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that is not restful to me. That is work to me. That's
Yeah.
what my parents used to have me do for chores. But for him, it was like one of those things where he could shut his brain off. He could like hear the birds singing. He'd tell me about hearing the birds singing and being out in nature and all this kind of stuff. And he would walk away feeling so like connected to the Lord, so refreshed, so filled back up. And if I do that, I feel like I just work. And so I think it's
Yeah.
understanding, like you were talking about your personality,
Yeah.
and realizing that what can be rest for one person may not be rest for somebody else. And so we need to kind of, understand that about each other.
Yeah, I think of maybe a couple other like personal examples of things that have been really helpful for us as a family. Like for me, one of the things that I've committed to is when I'm done with my like big tasks for the day, I'm done with
Yeah.
work. Right? There's always more work you can do. So some days, like that means that I'm getting done with work at 3 o'clock. Which is great. But usually, to be totally honest, when I'm doing that, when I'm getting done and like shutting my computer and moving on to the next thing, I'm a little like, man, I feel kind of bad. I feel like I should still be working. But the reality is, right, with the work that we're doing, and many of you who are watching this, if you're in ministry, like next week, I'm going to be gone doing ministry stuff for 6 days straight, which I'm super excited for. But that means I'm away from my family, and that means my wife is bearing the burden of that. So, but the trade-off is I can some days get done with work at 3 o'clock, or I can take a morning to be with family. Where I was working a more, traditional office kind of job, that wouldn't be the reality. So that's one thing. Another thing that's been really helpful for us is like on our weekends, we'll let the kids watch extra TV so that Kelly and I can sit and read and drink our coffee in the morning, or just sit and have extra conversation, which I think there's kind of some level of like guilt around that. Like, oh, you shouldn't let your kids do too much stuff like that. But man, we leave a half hour, 45 minutes of kids watching TV downstairs and us just having quiet time. Like sometimes that's the highlight of the day.
Yeah. We love, one of our big things in our family is making a huge breakfast that day, and then you kind of just leave the dishes for a while, and just kind of like, let's just, and so we will make like, we're gonna do caramel rolls and French toast and eggs and like as many different things as we could like fill up, and just kind of like enjoy being together and resting, and not feeling the burden of having to run from this to the next thing. And so yeah.
That's good. So maybe what are a couple, we've mentioned some stuff already, but what are some resources for your
Yeah, so I
check out?
mentioned Chandler's sermon. He has a couple sermons on rest. One of the things, that a book that I've really enjoyed that was super challenging for me, I've shared this to a few leaders that we're coaching, is this book called 5 Gears. And it's really kind of identifying what gear should I be in this moment, and whether it's work or rest or play or whatever, of just kind of recognizing. And so it's a great kind of, if you're a kind of a high capacity doer, it's a super challenging book that'll help you say, maybe I need to downshift into first gear, second gear here, that is more of a restful moment, and to be okay to do that. So that's a couple that I was thinking about.
Yeah, the book Saturate by Jeff Vanderstelt. I really appreciated the book as a whole is more about disciple making and some of the stuff that they've done through Soma and their missional community model. But they talk about rhythms of life in there. And one of their rhythms that they've adopted as a church is recreate or recreate. Which is really all about saying, hey, if you're going to follow Jesus, this is one of the rhythms that you have built into your life, is time for recreation. And so part of that being creating things. So they've got a lot of fun things that they've done in their communities over the years. And then another good book that both Andy and I have skimmed but not fully read is For God's Sake Rest by Jim Anderson. So that's a good book that goes kind of the whole breadth of the book is about this idea of making space for rest.
Yeah. In fact, I did basically a rest retreat with Jim, where he kind of walked through the different principles in that and gave us kind of space to rest. So it's a really good resource that I know a lot of people have appreciated.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, and I mean the reality is, man, if you want to be in ministry for the long haul, if you're going to survive in a healthy way, start getting rest integrated into your day-to-day life. We talk about in the productivity training, we talk about kind of the key rhythms being the weekly Sabbath. There's daily rhythms. Like, is there space? We didn't mention it. One of the things you mentioned earlier before we hopped on is the idea of thirds, like a third
Mm-hmm.
of your day devoted to work, a third of your day devoted to rest. And what's the other third? I don't know if you ever, is it?
No, it's just kind of understanding how many thirds, and if you do multiple thirds, more than 2/3 in a day, morning, afternoon, evening, that you need to give space on a different day to
Yeah.
account. Like you were talking about, if you're going to do a bunch of stuff the next week, how do you readjust
Yeah.
that week? So
Yeah. So think about that: weekly rhythms, daily rhythms, even monthly. One of the things that's really valuable for me, and I know you do similar, Andy, is this is maybe a little bit less like full rest, but it's stepping back from the normal work and taking a half day, roughly once a month, to think big picture. Say, okay, I'm not working in the ministry stuff. I'm going to step back and work
yeah,
on what we're doing. There's a lot of value in that.
it's good. Well, we hope that this was helpful for you today. As you're in the trenches within ministry, rest is important, and it's important for us to start from a place of rest, not end with a place of rest. Go work, 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 and collapse. And so we hope that this conversation just spurs you on to ask the question, what types of things am I doing proactively to create space for rest? Because we want you to be in ministry for the long haul. And what we've seen over and over again is, whether it's burnout or people kind of making bad decisions because they're on the edges too far, like part of that is that we don't have good balance or rest in our lives. So appreciate you, Ben, and the conversation today, and everybody else. Whenever you're watching this, we'll catch you on the next Friday conversation. We'll see
And
you later.
take a nap.
Yeah.